On the 26th of November, 1922, a British archaeologist named Howard Carter held a candle up to a small hole he had chipped in the upper left corner of a sealed doorway deep in the Valley of the Kings. Behind him stood his patron, Lord Carnarvon, Carnarvon's daughter Lady Evelyn Herbert, and Carter's assistant, Arthur Calendar. The four of them had been waiting for this moment. Carter for more than 6 years, Carnarvon for more than 15, and the tension in the narrow corridor was almost unbearable. Carter leaned forward and pressed his face to the hole. The candle flame flickered in the hot air, escaping from the sealed chamber beyond. For a moment he could see nothing. The candle's light struggled against 3,000 years of darkness. And then, as his eyes adjusted, shapes began to emerge. Gold. Everywhere, the glint of gold. Golden statues, golden furniture, golden objects, piled on top of each other in a chaotic splendor that the flickering candlelight could barely illuminate. Carnarvon, unable to contain himself, asked, "Can you see anything?" Carter, struggling to speak, replied with 2 words that would become the most quoted sentence in the history of archaeology. "Yes, wonderful things." The tomb was designated KV62, the 62nd tomb to be catalogued in the Valley of the Kings. It belonged to a pharaoh named Tutankhamun, a boy who had ascended the throne of Egypt at roughly 9 years of age, who had ruled for approximately 10 years, who had died at roughly 18 or 19, and who had been, for more than 3,000 years, one of the most thoroughly forgotten rulers in Egyptian history. His name had been deliberately erased from the official records. His monuments had been usurped by his successors. His tomb, small, hastily prepared, and tucked into an obscure corner of the valley, had been buried beneath the debris of later construction and forgotten by everyone, including the tomb robbers who had systematically plundered every other royal tomb in the valley. The forgetting saved the tomb. The erasure preserved the treasure, and the pharaoh who had been one of the least esteemed in life became, through the accident of his tomb's survival, the most famous pharaoh in death, the most recognized, the most exhibited, the most commercialized, the most culturally ubiquitous ruler in the 3,000-year history of Egyptian civilization. By the end of tonight, you're going to understand who Tutankhamun actually was. Not the golden mask, not the curse, not the merchandising empire, but the actual person. A child who inherited a kingdom in crisis. A boy who was placed on the throne of the world's most powerful state at an age when most children are learning to read. A young man who died before he had a chance to accomplish anything of lasting significance. And whose death, whose burial, whose forgotten tomb, and whose accidental rediscovery produced the most famous archaeological event in history. Before we get started, if you find these mysteries as fascinating as we do, take a second to like the video or subscribe. It's a simple action, but it helps this channel reach more curious minds like yours. Now, let's begin. To understand Tutankhamun, begin with his father, because Tutankhamun's story is, in every essential respect, the story of a son cleaning up his father's mess. Tutankhamun's father was Akhenaten, the heretic pharaoh, the most controversial ruler in Egyptian history, the man who abolished the worship of the traditional gods, closed the temples, dispersed the priesthoods, and attempted to replace the entire Egyptian religious system with the exclusive worship of a single deity, the Aten, the sun disk. Akhenaten's revolution was the most radical transformation in the 3,000-year history of Egyptian civilization. A top-down, state-imposed religious revolution that upended every aspect of Egyptian life, from the theological to the economic, from the artistic to the administrative. Akhenaten moved the capital from Thebes to a new city that he built in the desert of Middle Egypt, Akhetaten, the horizon of the Aten, modern Tel El Amarna. He closed the temples of Amun at Karnak. He redirected the temple revenues from the Amun priesthood to the Aten cult. He commissioned a new artistic style, the distinctive, elongated, almost grotesque Amarna style that rejected the traditional conventions of Egyptian art. And he withdrew from international affairs, neglecting Egypt's empire in the Levant, ignoring the desperate pleas of his vassal kings, allowing the Hittites to expand into territories that Egypt had controlled for generations. The revolution lasted for roughly 17 years, the duration of Akhenaten's reign. When Akhenaten died, Around 1336 BC, the revolution died with him. The boy who succeeded him, Tutankhamun, as he was initially named, the living image of the Aten, was roughly 9 years old. The child was too young to govern. The real power was in the hands of the advisors, the Vizier I, the General Horemheb, and possibly others, who recognized that Akhenaten's revolution had been a disaster, and who set about reversing it with the same thoroughness with which Akhenaten had imposed it. The reversal was comprehensive. The capital was moved back to Thebes. The temples of Amun were reopened. The priesthoods were restored. The traditional artistic style was reinstated. The boy king's name was changed from Tutankhaten, the living image of the Aten, to Tutankhamun, the living image of Amun, a symbolic repudiation of his father's god and an embrace of the god that his father had tried to destroy. The restoration stela, a large limestone slab erected at Karnak, inscribed with a declaration that described the state of the country that Tutankhamun had inherited, painted a picture of devastation. The temples in ruins, the shrines overgrown with weeds, the gods having turned their backs on this land. The stela announced the restoration, the reopening of the temples, the re-endowment of the priesthoods, the renewal of the divine services that Akhenaten had interrupted. The restoration was politically necessary, but it was also, from Tutankhamun's perspective, personally dangerous. The boy was the son of the heretic. He bore the heretic's blood. He had been born at the heretic's capital, raised in the heretic's court, named after the heretic's god. The restoration, the repudiation of his father's revolution, the embrace of the religion that his father had tried to destroy, was an act of political survival. The boy king was not restoring the old religion because he believed in it. He was restoring it because the alternative was the destruction of his dynasty, and, probably, the destruction of himself. The core problem of Tutankhamun is the problem of fame without achievement, the problem of a pharaoh who did nothing remarkable during his lifetime, and who became the most famous ruler in history because of the manner of his death, the circumstances of his burial, and the accident of his tomb's survival. Tutankhamun ruled for approximately 10 years, from roughly 1332 to 1323 BC. During those 10 years, he accomplished very little that can be attributed to him personally. The restoration of the Amun cult was managed by his advisors. The military campaigns, limited operations in Nubia and the Levant, were commanded by his generals. The building programs, modest additions to Karnak and other temples, were directed by his administrators. The boy king was a figurehead, a child on a throne, surrounded by experienced officials who governed in his name, who made the decisions, who managed the affairs of state, and who used the boy's royal authority to legitimize their own power. The boy died young, at approximately 18 or 19 years of age. The cause of his death has been debated for decades. CT scans of his mummy, conducted in 2005 and in subsequent studies, revealed a severe fracture of the left leg, a break that had become infected, producing a condition that may have contributed to his death. DNA analysis, conducted in 2010, revealed that Tutankhamun suffered from malaria. The parasites of the disease were found in his tissue samples. The combination of a badly infected leg fracture and a malarial infection may have been sufficient to kill a young man whose general health was already compromised by the genetic consequences of inbreeding. Tutankhamun's parents were brother and sister, and the DNA analysis revealed a pattern of congenital conditions that included a clubfoot and bone disorder that would have made walking difficult. The boy king walked with a cane. More than 130 walking sticks were found in his tomb, a number that suggests not a collection but a necessity. The golden throne found in the antechamber depicts Tutankhamun seated while his wife, Ankhesenamun, stands before him, a reversal of the normal Egyptian iconographic convention, which shows the pharaoh standing. The reversal may reflect the reality. A young king who could not stand for long periods, who relied on walking aids, who was physically compromised by the genetic legacy of his parents' consanguinity. And it gets worse. Ankhesenamun, Tutankhamun's wife, his half-sister, the daughter of Akhenaten and Nefertiti, was left without an heir after Tutankhamun's death. 2 fatal mummies found in the tomb, tiny, perfectly mummified. placed in miniature coffins, are believed to be the couple's stillborn children. The DNA analysis confirmed that the fetuses were Tutankhamun's daughters. The couple produced no surviving children. The dynastic line ended with Tutankhamun's death. What followed the death was a power struggle, a struggle that Ankhesenamun tried, desperately, to influence. The Hittite archives contain a letter, one of the most extraordinary documents in ancient Near Eastern diplomacy, from an Egyptian queen, identified by most scholars as Ankhesenamun, to the Hittite king Suppiluliuma I. The letter reads, "My husband has died. I have no son. They say about you that you have many sons. You might give me one of your sons to become my husband. I would not wish to take one of my subjects as a husband." The letter is astonishing. An Egyptian queen asking a foreign king, Egypt's principal rival, to send one of his sons to marry her and to become Pharaoh. The desperation is palpable. The letter reveals a woman who was willing to do anything, including installing a foreign prince on the throne of Egypt to prevent the seizure of power by the men who had controlled her husband's reign. The Hittite prince was sent. He was murdered before he reached Egypt, assassinated, probably by Ai or Hor-Emheb, who had no intention of allowing a foreign prince to occupy the Egyptian throne. Ankhesenamun married Ai, the elderly advisor who had managed Tutankhamun's government. Ai ruled for roughly 4 years before dying and being succeeded by Hor-Emheb, the general who completed the erasure of the Amarna legacy by removing the names of Akhenaten, Tutankhamun, and Ai from the official records, claiming their regnal years as his own, and acting as if the Amarna period had never occurred. But here's what makes this truly terrifying. The erasure was almost successful. Tutankhamun was almost completely forgotten. His name was removed from the king lists. His monuments were usurped. His tomb, small and insignificant by royal standards, was buried beneath the debris from the construction of the tomb of Ramesses VI, which was cut into the cliff directly above it. The burial of the entrance was accidental, a byproduct of construction activity that occurred roughly a century after Tutankhamun's death. But the accident was decisive. The debris sealed the entrance. The workers' huts were built on top of it, and the tomb, with its golden shrines, its golden coffins, its golden mask, its 5,000 artifacts, was hidden from the world for more than 3,000 years. Howard Carter was not a typical archaeologist. He was not university educated. He was not from a wealthy family. He was the son of an artist, a draftsman who had been trained to draw and paint, who had come to Egypt at the age of 17 to work as a copyist for the Egypt Exploration Fund, and who had taught himself archaeology through years of fieldwork, observation, and stubborn, self-directed study. Carter was brilliant. Carter was difficult. Carter was obstinate, short-tempered, and incapable of the diplomatic courtesies that the British colonial establishment in Egypt required. He had been forced to resign from the Egyptian Antiquities Service in 1903 after a confrontation with a group of French tourists at the Serapeum at Saqqara. For 3 years after his resignation, he was unemployed, selling watercolour paintings to tourists in Luxor, living on the margins of the archaeological community, waiting for the opportunity that would restore his career. The opportunity came in 1907, when Carter was introduced to George Herbert, the 5th Earl of Carnarvon, a wealthy English aristocrat who had come to Egypt for his health and who had developed an interest in Egyptology. Carnarvon had money. Carter had expertise. The partnership was productive. They excavated several minor tombs in the Theban necropolis and published a well-received scholarly work. But the prize that Carter was after was not a minor tomb. It was the tomb of Tutankhamun, the one major 18th dynasty pharaoh whose burial had never been found. Carter's conviction that Tutankhamun's tomb remained undiscovered was based on evidence. Scattered artifacts bearing Tutankhamun's name that had been found in the Valley of the Kings by earlier excavators, including Theodore Davis, who had held the excavation concession before Carnarvon. Davis, after finding a few objects with Tutankhamun's name, declared that the valley was exhausted, that there was nothing left to find. Carter disagreed. He believed that the artifacts indicated the presence of an undiscovered tomb and that the tomb was located in an area of the valley that had not been fully excavated, the area near the entrance to, the tomb of Ramesses VI, where the ancient workers' huts had prevented previous excavators from digging. Carter began his systematic search in 1915. For 6 seasons, 6 years of painstaking, grid by grid, trench by trench excavation, he found nothing. His workers moved an estimated 200,000 tons of rubble. The results were negligible. Carnarvon, who was funding the excavation, grew increasingly frustrated. By 1922, Carnarvon was ready to abandon the search. He summoned Carter to England and told him that the funding would be cut. Carter, in a final, desperate gamble, persuaded Carnarvon to finance one more season, one last chance, one final roll of the dice. Carter returned to the valley in November of 1922. He ordered the removal of the ancient workers' huts near the entrance to the tomb of Ramesses VI, the one area of the valley that he had not yet fully investigated. On the 4th of November, a worker uncovered a stone step cut into the bedrock, the first step of a descending staircase that led to a sealed doorway. Carter, recognizing the significance of the discovery, ordered the staircase refilled and sent a telegram to Carnarvon. At last have made wonderful discovery in valley, a magnificent tomb with seals intact. Carnarvon arrived 3 weeks later. The staircase was cleared, the sealed doorway was revealed, and on the 26th of November, Carter made the small hole in the upper corner of the doorway and held up the candle and saw the wonderful things. The tomb consisted of 4 chambers: the antechamber, the annex, the burial chamber, and the treasury. The antechamber, the first room that Carter saw through the hole, contained hundreds of objects, piled in apparent disorder: gilded couches in the shape of animals, dismantled chariots, alabaster vessels, game boards, food containers, and 2 life-sized guardian statues of the king, standing sentinel on either side of a sealed doorway that led to the burial chamber beyond. The burial chamber, when it was finally opened in February of 1923, contained the most extraordinary assemblage of funerary equipment ever discovered in an Egyptian tomb. 4 nested shrines, massive gilded wooden structures, each one fitting inside the next like a set of nesting boxes, enclosed a quartzite sarcophagus. Within the sarcophagus lay 3 nested coffins, the outermost of gilded wood, the middle of gilded wood inlaid with coloured glass, and the innermost of solid gold, weighing approximately 110 kilograms. Within the innermost coffin lay the mummy of Tutankhamun, its face covered by the golden mask, the mask that would become the most recognizable face in the history of art. The Amarna period, the era of Akhenaten's religious revolution, was the most traumatic episode in the history of Egyptian civilization. The revolution disrupted every aspect of Egyptian life. The religious system that had sustained the population for more than 1,500 years was abolished. The temples that had been the economic engines of the country were closed, the priesthoods that had managed the temples were dispersed, and the artistic traditions that had defined Egyptian culture since the Old Kingdom were replaced with a new, radically different aesthetic. The disruption was comprehensive. The recovery, the restoration that Tutankhamun's advisors managed, was long, painful, and never entirely complete. The economic consequences of the revolution were particularly severe. The temples of Amun, the largest and wealthiest religious institutions in Egypt, controlled vast agricultural estates whose revenues funded not only the temple operations but also a significant portion of the Egyptian economy. When Akhenaten closed the temples and redirected their revenues to the Aten cult, the economic disruption was felt across the country. The temple employees lost their jobs, the agricultural production was diverted, the trade networks that the temples had managed were disrupted, and the local economies that depended on the temples for employment and for the distribution of food and other goods were damaged. The Restoration Stela, the document that Tutankhamun erected at Karnak to announce the restoration of the old religion, describes the state of the country in language that is both propagandistic and probably accurate. The temples of the gods and goddesses, from Elephantine to the marshes of the Delta, had fallen into neglect. Their shrines had become desolate, had become mounds overgrown with weeds. Their sanctuaries were as if they had never been. Their halls were a footpath. The description is formulaic. It follows the conventions of Egyptian restoration texts, which always emphasize the severity of the damage in order to magnify the achievement of the restoration. but the description is also probably accurate. The temples had been closed for roughly 17 years. Their maintenance had been neglected. Their revenues had been diverted, and the physical deterioration that results from 17 years of institutional abandonment would have been significant. The restoration that Tutankhamun's advisors managed was not merely religious, it was economic. The reopening of the temples meant the restoration of the temple economies, the re-employment of the temple staff, the reactivation of the agricultural estates, and the resumption of the economic functions that the temples had performed before the revolution. The restoration was also political. It was designed to restore the alliance between the pharaoh and the Amun priesthood that had been the foundation of Egyptian governance for centuries, and that the Akhenaten had shattered. The marriage of Tutankhamun and Ankhesenamun, a union between two children of the Amarna court, was itself a product of the political calculations that surrounded the restoration. Ankhesenamun was Akhenaten's daughter, born at Amarna, raised in the heretical court, named after the Aten. Her original name was Ankhesenparten. She lives through the Aten. Her marriage to Tutankhamun linked the two branches of the royal family and provided a veneer of dynastic continuity that the restoration required. The name change from Ankhesenparten to Ankhesenamun, from she lives through the Aten to she lives through Amun, was a public declaration of the couple's rejection of the heretical religion and their embrace of the restored orthodoxy. The couple were children when they married. Tutankhamun was roughly 9, Ankhesenamun was roughly 13. They were raised together in the Amarna court. They shared a childhood, a religious transformation, a political crisis, and, eventually, a tomb. The two stillborn children found in the tomb, the foetal mummies, placed in miniature coffins buried alongside the king, are the material evidence of the couple's reproductive failure. The failure was probably a consequence of the consanguinity, the genetic closeness of two individuals who were half-siblings, whose parents were themselves closely related, whose bloodline was compressed by generations of royal inbreeding into a genetic bottleneck that produced the congenital conditions, the club foot, the bone disorder, the general physical weakness that characterized Tutankhamun's body and that probably contributed to the stillbirths of his children. The DNA analysis of Tutankhamun's family, published in 2010, was one of the most significant applications of genetic technology to archaeological material. The analysis, conducted by an Egyptian team led by Zahi Hawass, examined tissue samples from Tutankhamun's mummy and from 11 other royal mummies, producing a family tree that confirmed the identities of Tutankhamun's parents, Akhenaten, and a woman identified as the younger lady from tomb KV35, who was Akhenaten's sister, and that revealed the genetic consequences of the royal family's inbreeding. The analysis identified the malaria parasite in Tutankhamun's tissue, evidence that the king suffered from the disease. The analysis also identified a bone disorder, Kola disease, that affected Tutankhamun's left foot, producing the club foot that the walking sticks were designed to compensate for. The tomb's contents, the 5,398 objects, represent the most complete Egyptian royal burial assemblage ever discovered. The objects include every category of funerary provision that the Egyptian mortuary tradition prescribed. The ritual objects include the canopic chest, containing the 4 miniature coffins that held the king's internal organs, the Shabti figures, servants for the afterlife, 413 of them, the magical bricks, protective amulets placed at the 4 cardinal points of the burial chamber, and the opening of the mouth implements, the ritual tools used in the ceremony that restored the mummy's ability to eat, drink, and breathe in the afterlife. The personal objects include the king's clothing, linen garments, leather sandals, and the elaborately decorated ceremonial robes that the king wore during religious festivals, his jewelry, pectorals, bracelets, rings, and earrings of gold, silver, and precious stones, his weapons, bows, arrows, daggers, and throw sticks, his musical instruments, trumpets that were famously played in a BBC broadcast in 1939, producing a sound that had not been heard for 3,200 years, and his games, a sonnet board, with playing pieces, the game that the Egyptians believed the dead played in the afterlife. The furniture includes the golden throne, one of the most important objects in the entire collection. The throne is decorated with a scene showing Tutankhamun seated while Ankhesenamun stands before him, anointing him with perfumed oil. The scene is remarkable for its intimacy. The queen's hand rests on the king's shoulder, her body leans toward his, their faces are close together. The style of the scene is Amarna. The figures are depicted in the elongated naturalistic Amarna artistic convention, not in the traditional Egyptian style. The throne was probably made at Amarna before the restoration, and was included in the burial as a personal object rather than as a religious one. The presence of the Amarna-style throne in the tomb of the pharaoh who had repudiated the Amarna religion is a poignant reminder that the political transformation, the change of name, the change of religion, the change of capital, did not erase the personal history. The boy had been born at Amarna, he had been raised at Amarna, and the throne that he had used at Amarna went with him into the tomb, carrying the images and the style of the world that he had been forced to repudiate. The 4 nested shrines that enclose the sarcophagus are among the largest individual objects ever recovered from an Egyptian tomb. The outermost shrine measures roughly 5 meters long, 3.5 meters wide, and 2¾ meters tall, filling the burial chamber almost completely, with only a few centimeters of clearance between the shrine walls and the chamber walls. The shrines are made of wood, covered with gold leaf, and decorated with religious texts and images, the Book of the Dead, the Amduat, the Litany of Ra, and other funerary compositions that were designed to protect the king and to guide him through the underworld to the afterlife. The dismantling of the shrines, which Carter had to accomplish within the confined space of the burial chamber, was one of the most technically challenging phases of the excavation and took more than 2 years to complete. The erasure of Tutankhamun by Horemheb was part of a broader program of damnatio memoriae, the deliberate destruction of the memory of the Amarna period that extended beyond Tutankhamun to include his father Akhenaten, his predecessor Smenkhkare, and his immediate successor Ai. Horemheb's intention was not merely to remove individuals from the historical record, but to eliminate the entire Amarna interlude, to act as if the religious revolution had never occurred, as if the 17 years of Akhenaten's reign and the decade of Tutankhamun's reign had been a blank, a void, a period during which nothing had happened and no one had ruled. The erasure was accomplished through several complementary mechanisms. The first was the physical destruction of inscriptions, the chiseling of cartouches from walls, the removal of names from stelae, the defacement of reliefs that depicted the Amarna royals. The second was the administrative appropriation. Horemheb claimed the regnal years of Tutankhamun and Ai as his own, adding them to his own reign total, so that official records showed Horemheb ruling for the entire period from the death of Amenhotep III to his own death. The third was the architectural usurpation. Horemheb took credit for buildings and monuments that had been constructed during Tutankhamun's reign, replacing Tutankhamun's cartouches with his own, so that the buildings appeared to have been built by Horemheb rather than by the boy king. The usurpation was extensive. The restoration stela at Karnak, the document that Tutankhamun had erected to announce the restoration of the Amun cult, was usurped by Horemheb, who replaced Tutankhamun's name with his own. The colossal statues that Tutankhamun had erected at Karnak were reinscribed with Horemheb's name. The temples that Tutankhamun had begun or completed were attributed to Horemheb. The cumulative effect was the erasure of Tutankhamun from the monumental record of the 18th dynasty, the physical elimination of every visible trace of the boy king's existence from the landscape of Egyptian civilization. The erasure extended to the Abydos king list, the canonical list of legitimate pharaohs that was inscribed on the walls of Seti I's temple at Abydos. The list, which records the names of the pharaohs from Menes to Seti, omits Akhenaten, Smenkhkare, Tutankhamun, and Ai, leaping directly from Amenhotep III to Horemheb, as if the Amarna period had never occurred. The omission is deliberate. The compilers of the list, working under Seti's authority, excluded the Amarna pharaohs because their reigns were considered illegitimate, tainted by the heresy, and unworthy of inclusion in the official record of legitimate kingship. The omission from the king lists had practical consequences for later Egyptian historians. Manetho, the Egyptian priest who compiled a history of Egypt in the 3rd century BC, relied on the king lists for his chronological framework. Because the king lists omitted Tutankhamun, Manetho's history omitted him too. And because Manetho's history was the primary source for the classical and medieval understanding of Egyptian chronology, the omission was transmitted through the centuries. From Manetho to the Greek historians, from the Greek historians to the Roman historians, from the Roman historians to the medieval scholars who inherited the classical tradition. Tutankhamun was absent from the historical record, not because his existence was unknown, but because his existence was officially denied. Erased from the king lists, omitted from the histories, buried beneath the institutional fiction that Horemheb had constructed. The rediscovery of Tutankhamun by modern Egyptology preceded the discovery of the tomb by several decades. Scholars of the 19th century, working with the fragmentary evidence that the erasure had failed to destroy, had pieced together the existence of a pharaoh named Tutankhamun, had assigned him an approximate place in the dynastic sequence, and had identified the Valley of the Kings as the probable location of his tomb. The evidence was scattered. A few objects bearing his name, found in the valley by Theodore Davis and other excavators, a few inscriptions that had escaped the erasure, a few references in texts that had survived the destruction. The evidence was sufficient to establish that Tutankhamun had existed but insufficient to determine the location of his tomb or the nature of his reign. Carter's conviction that the tomb could be found was based on this fragmentary evidence and on a logical deduction that proved to be correct. The fragments bearing Tutankhamun's name had been found in the Valley of the Kings. The valley had been systematically excavated by several generations of archaeologists, but one area of the valley had not been fully investigated. The area near the entrance to the tomb of Ramesses VI, where the ancient workers' huts had prevented previous excavators from digging. Carter reasoned that if the tomb was anywhere in the valley, it was probably in this unexcavated area. He was right. The tomb's architecture, its small size, its irregular plan, its limited decoration, is consistent with a tomb that was not originally designed for a king. The standard royal tomb in the Valley of the Kings is a long descending corridor, penetrating deep into the rock, with multiple chambers, pillared halls, and extensive decoration. KV62 is nothing like this. It is small, roughly 110 square meters of floor space, compared to the several hundred square meters of a standard royal tomb. It has only 4 chambers: the antechamber, the annex, the burial chamber, and the treasury, compared to the dozens of chambers in the larger royal tombs, and its decoration is limited to the burial chamber. The other 3 chambers have bare, undecorated walls. The most likely explanation for the tomb's unusual characteristics is that it was originally cut for a non-royal individual, possibly a high official, and was adapted for Tutankhamun's burial when the king died unexpectedly, and his intended tomb, possibly KV23, which was later used by I, was not yet complete. The adaptation would have been hasty. The burial had to take place within the 70-day period prescribed by the mummification process, leaving little time for extensive modification or decoration. The haste explains the tomb's small size, its limited decoration, and the disordered state of some of its contents. All features that are consistent with a burial that was conducted under time pressure rather than with the deliberate, carefully planned preparation that characterized the burials of more established pharaohs. The golden shrine that enclosed the sarcophagus in the burial chamber is one of the most elaborate and most theologically significant objects in the entire collection. The shrine, or rather, the 4 nested shrines, each one fitting inside the next, occupied almost the entire volume of the burial chamber, leaving only a narrow passage between the shrine walls and the chamber walls, through which the mourners and the ritual officiants could move. The shrines are made of wood, cedar and other hardwoods, covered with gold leaf and decorated with religious texts and images that were designed to protect the king and to facilitate his journey through the underworld. The outermost shrine bears the texts of the Book of the Dead. a collection of spells and incantations that protected the dead on their journey through the underworld. The second shrine bears texts from the Book of the Amduat, the description of the sun god's nightly journey through the 12 hours of the night, which the dead king was expected to accompany. The third shrine bears texts from additional funerary compositions, and the innermost shrine, the final wooden enclosure directly surrounding the sarcophagus, bears the most sacred and most protective texts of all, the texts that were closest to the king's body and that provided the most immediate magical protection. The sarcophagus itself, a massive quartzite box carved from a single block of stone, its corners guarded by 4 goddesses, Isis, Nephthys, Neith, and Selket, whose figures are carved in high relief with their arms outstretched in gestures of protection, is one of the most impressive stone objects in the tomb. The sarcophagus lid, made from red granite rather than quartzite, suggesting a hasty substitution when the original lid was not available, was cracked, possibly during the burial, possibly during a later earthquake, and repaired in antiquity with gypsum plaster. The crack and the repair are visible, evidence that even the most sacred elements of the burial were subject to the accidents and the improvisations that characterized this hurried funeral. The deeper truth of Tutankhamun is the truth about the relationship between obscurity and preservation, about the paradox that the pharaoh who was most aggressively erased from history is the pharaoh whose burial has been most completely preserved. The paradox is precise. Tutankhamun was erased because he was associated with the Amarna heresy, because he was Akhenaten's son, because he bore the heretic's blood, because his reign was contaminated by its connection to the religious revolution that the subsequent pharaohs were determined to forget. The erasure was systematic. His name was removed from the king lists. His monuments were usurped. His regnal years were absorbed into the reigns of his successors. The erasure was designed to eliminate Tutankhamun from the historical record, to act as if he had never existed, to close the gap that his reign occupied in the dynastic sequence, to deny him the afterlife that the preservation of his name was supposed to guarantee. The erasure failed, but not in the way that Tutankhamun's supporters might have wished. The erasure did not preserve Tutankhamun's memory. It did the opposite. It made him so thoroughly forgotten that no one remembered where he was buried, and the forgetting, the total, comprehensive, 3,000-year forgetting of the pharaoh who had been one of the least esteemed rulers in Egyptian history, was the condition that preserved the tomb. The tomb survived because it was forgotten. The tomb was forgotten because the pharaoh was erased. The erasure that was designed to condemn Tutankhamun to oblivion inadvertently preserved the most complete royal burial in the history of Egyptian archaeology. Let that sink in. The curse that was placed on Tutankhamun, the damnatio memoriae, the condemnation of memory, the theological punishment that was supposed to deny him eternal life, turned out to be the blessing that gave him eternal fame. The pharaohs who erased Tutankhamun's name, Horemheb, who usurped his monuments, who claimed his regnal years, who acted as if Tutankhamun had never existed, inadvertently preserved his tomb. By removing Tutankhamun from the official records, they ensured that no one would look for his tomb. By making him insignificant, they ensured that no tomb robber would bother to search for his burial. By condemning him to oblivion, they created the conditions under which his tomb, small, insignificant, buried beneath the debris of later construction, would survive intact for 3,300 years. The irony is one of the most devastating in the history of archaeology. The pharaohs who built the largest tombs, Seti I, Ramesses II, Ramesses III, had their burials robbed in antiquity, their mummies stripped, their funerary equipment looted, their golden coffins melted down. The pharaoh who built the smallest tomb, the boy king, the minor ruler, the forgotten son of the heretic, had his burial preserved intact, his mummy untouched, apart from 2 ancient robbery attempts that penetrated only the outer chambers, his golden coffins undisturbed, his 5,000 artifacts waiting in the darkness for 3,300 years. This is not science fiction. This is the documented, verifiable, archaeologically attested relationship between obscurity and preservation. The demonstration that the most famous archaeological discovery in history was made possible not by the pharaoh's greatness, but by his insignificance, not by his achievements, but by his failures, not by his power, but by his powerlessness. The 5,398 objects catalogued by Carter and his team constitute the most complete assemblage of Egyptian funerary equipment ever discovered. The objects include items from every category of Egyptian funerary provision: the ritual objects that the dead king needed for his afterlife journey, the personal objects that he had used during his lifetime, the food and drink that would sustain him in the underworld, the clothing and jewelry that he would wear in the eternal realm, the furniture and the games, and the musical instruments that would provide him with comfort and entertainment for eternity. The golden mask, weighing approximately 11 kilograms, fashioned from 2 sheets of gold, inlaid with lapis lazuli, obsidian, turquoise, and colored glass, is the most recognized object in the history of art. The mask was placed directly on the mummy's face, covering the head and shoulders, providing the dead king with an idealized image that would serve as his eternal countenance. The face of the mask is not, strictly speaking, a portrait. It is an idealization, a theological image, a representation of the dead king as Osiris, the god of the underworld. But the face has become the face of Tutankhamun, the image that the world associates with the boy king. The face that appears on posters, on book covers, on t-shirts, on coffee mugs, on every commercial product that has ever traded on the name of the most famous pharaoh in history. Carter's working methodology at KV-62 set the standard for archaeological excavation in the 20th century, a standard of meticulous documentation, careful conservation, and systematic recording that transformed the discipline from the treasure-hunting adventure it had sometimes resembled into the rigorous science it aspired to be. Carter was not the first archaeologist to practice careful documentation. Flinders Petrie had established the principles of systematic excavation decades earlier, but Carter was the first to apply these principles to a discovery of such magnitude and such public visibility, demonstrating to the world that archaeological excavation was not merely a matter of digging up objects, but of recording, contextualizing, and preserving the information that the objects contained. The recording process was extraordinary in its thoroughness. Each object was assigned a unique catalogue number. Each object was photographed in situ, in its original position within the tomb, before being touched. Each object's position was plotted on a scaled plan of the chamber. Each object's condition was described in a written record that noted its material, its dimensions, its state of preservation, and any damage or deterioration. The process was slow. Each object required hours of documentation before it could be moved. The process was also essential. Without the documentation, the spatial relationships between the objects, the way they were arranged within the tomb, the order in which the ancient priests had placed them, would have been lost forever. The conservation challenges were immense. Many of the objects were in fragile condition. The wood had dried out over 3,000 years, becoming brittle and prone to cracking. The gold leaf that covered many of the wooden objects was detaching from the surface. The leather was desiccated. The linen was fragile. The adhesives that the ancient craftsmen had used to join the components had deteriorated. Carter's team, which included the chemist Alfred Lucas, one of the pioneers of archaeological conservation, developed new techniques for stabilizing the objects, using paraffin wax, cellulose nitrate, and other materials to consolidate the fragile surfaces and to prevent further deterioration during handling and transport. The transport of the objects from the tomb to the laboratory. A journey of roughly 8 kilometers, from the Valley of the Kings to Carter's workroom at a converted tomb near the entrance to the valley, was itself a significant logistical operation. The objects were carried by hand, wrapped in cotton wadding, placed on padded trays, loaded onto a narrow-gauge railway that ran from the tomb entrance to the workroom. The largest objects, the gilded shrines, the sarcophagus lid, the guardian statues, required special handling arrangements. The journey was nerve-wracking. A single stumble, a single jolt, a single moment of carelessness could have damaged an object that had survived 3,300 years intact. The political context of the excavation The complex relationship between Carnarvon, the Egyptian government, and the international press added another layer of difficulty to the archaeological work. The Egyptian Revolution of 1919 had changed the political landscape. Egypt had achieved nominal independence in February 1922, and the Egyptian government, now responsible for antiquities policy, was asserting its authority over foreign excavators. The question of who owned the tomb's contents, the Egyptian government, which claimed sovereignty over all antiquities found on Egyptian soil, or Lord Carnarvon, whose concession had traditionally entitled him to a share of the finds, was a politically explosive issue that complicated the excavation from beginning to end. Carnarvon's death in April 1923 removed the excavation's primary funder and precipitated a crisis in the relationship between Carter and the Egyptian authorities. Carter, who had negotiated the excavation concession through Carnarvon, found himself dealing directly with the Egyptian government, a government that was increasingly assertive about its rights over the tomb's contents, and that was increasingly suspicious of Carter's intentions. The relationship deteriorated over the course of the 1920s, leading to several confrontations, a brief suspension of Carter's access to the tomb, and a legal dispute that was not resolved until 1925. The dispute was, in one sense, a conflict between two legitimate claims: the claim of the excavator, who had invested years of effort and substantial financial resources in the discovery, and the claim of the nation, which owned the cultural heritage and which had the right to determine its disposition. The resolution, in which the Egyptian government retained all of the tomb's contents, with no share going to the excavator, established the principle that has governed Egyptian antiquities law ever since. All antiquities found on Egyptian soil belong to the Egyptian state. The annex, the smallest of the tomb's 4 chambers, accessed through a low doorway in the southwest corner of the antechamber, contained the most disordered assemblage of objects in the tomb. The room, which measured roughly 4 meters by 2.5 meters, was packed with hundreds of objects: oils, ointments, food containers, wine jars, baskets, game boards, bows, boomerangs, and other items, piled in a jumble that suggested either hasty packing or ancient robbery, or both. The annex was the last room to be cleared. Carter did not begin work on it until the late 1920s, and the clearance of its contents took several years. The treasury, the chamber beyond the burial chamber, accessed through an open doorway flanked by the figure of the jackal god Anubis, contained the tomb's most sacred objects. The canopic shrine, a gilded wooden structure containing an alabaster canopic chest, within which 4 miniature coffins held the king's preserved internal organs, was the centerpiece of the room. The shrine was guarded by 4 goddesses: Isis, Nephthys, Neith, and Selket, whose gilded figures stood at the 4 corners of the shrine, their arms outstretched in a gesture of protection. The goddesses are among the most beautiful objects in the entire collection, their faces delicate, their bodies graceful, their gestures elegant, their expressions conveying a tenderness that makes the viewer feel that these are not merely religious images but personal guardians, watching over the dead king with the same care and concern that a mother would show for a sleeping child. The treasury also contained the 2 miniature coffins that held the mummified remains of the stillborn children, the daughters of Tutankhamun and Ankhesenamun, who were born dead and who were buried with their father. The coffins are heartbreaking, tiny, perfectly crafted, designed for occupants who would never grow to fill them. The mummies within are fragile, the bodies of premature infants, mummified with the same care that was accorded to the king himself, placed in miniature coffins that reproduce, at a reduced scale, the elaborate funerary equipment of a royal burial. The stillborn children are the most personal objects in the tomb, the evidence of a young couple's reproductive tragedy, the physical remains of the heirs who were supposed to continue the dynasty and who died before they were born. The Ankhesenamun letter to the Hittite king Suppiluliuma, the desperate plea for a foreign prince to marry and to prevent the seizure of power by the courtiers who had managed Tutankhamun's reign, is one of the most dramatic documents in ancient Near Eastern diplomacy. The letter, preserved in the Hittite archive at the site of Hattusa in modern Turkey, records the queen's appeal. "My husband has died and I have no son. They say about you that you have many sons. You might give me one of your sons to become my husband. Never shall I pick out a servant of mine and make him my husband. I am afraid." The phrase "I am afraid" is one of the most haunting sentences in ancient literature. The queen, the daughter of a heretic, the wife of a dead boy, the mother of 2 stillborn children, was afraid. Afraid of the men who had managed her husband's government and who were now positioning themselves to seize the throne. Afraid of the marriage that the power structure would impose on her. A marriage to the elderly vizier, the man who had controlled her husband's reign and who would, by marrying the queen, legitimize his own claim to the kingship. Afraid of the future. A future in which she would be powerless, in which her dynasty would end, in which the throne of Egypt would pass to men who had no royal blood and no dynastic legitimacy. The fear was justified. The Hittite prince, Zenanza, a son of Suppiluliuma, was sent to Egypt. He was murdered en route, killed, probably, by agents of Ai or Horemheb, who had no intention of allowing a foreign prince to sit on the throne of Horus. Ankhesenamun married Ai. Ai became pharaoh. Ankhesenamun disappeared from the historical record. Her fate is unknown. She may have died. She may have been killed. She may have been confined to a harem or a provincial estate, living out the remainder of her life in the obscurity that the new regime considered appropriate for the widow of the heretic's son. The story of Ankhesenamun, the story of a young woman caught between the death of her husband and the ambitions of his successors, between the loss of her children and the loss of her kingdom, between the desperate gamble of the Hittite letter and the brutal reality of the Hittite prince's murder, is one of the most poignant personal stories in the history of ancient Egypt. The story is preserved not in the tomb of Tutankhamun, but in the archives of the Hittites, the enemies of Egypt, the rivals of the pharaohs, the foreign power to whom the queen turned in her desperation. The story connects the golden burial at KV62 to the geopolitical world that surrounded it, to the power struggles, the diplomatic intrigues, the military rivalries, and the personal tragedies that characterized the end of the 18th dynasty. The Valley of the Kings, the narrow, desert valley on the west bank of the Nile at Thebes, where the pharaohs of the New Kingdom were buried, is the most famous necropolis in the history of archaeology. The valley contains the tombs of virtually every pharaoh of the 18th, 19th, and 20th dynasties, from Thutmose I to Ramesses XI, spanning a period of roughly 500 years, from approximately 1500 to 1070 BC. The tombs are cut into the limestone cliffs of the valley, long, descending corridors, penetrating deep into the rock, terminating in burial chambers that were decorated with religious texts and images, designed to guide the dead king through the underworld to the afterlife. The valley was chosen as the royal burial ground for reasons of security. The pharaohs of the New Kingdom, having witnessed the robbing of the Old Kingdom pyramids and the Middle Kingdom tombs, decided that a hidden burial in a remote valley was more secure than a visible monument on an exposed plateau. The strategy was logical. The strategy was also, ultimately, unsuccessful. Virtually every tomb in the valley was robbed in antiquity, most of them within a few centuries of the burial. The royal mummies were stripped of their gold and their jewelry, rewrapped by the priests, and cached in secret hiding places. The 2 major caches, found in 1881 at Deir el-Bahari and in 1898 in the tomb of Amenhotep II, contain the mummies of dozens of royal individuals, stripped, rewrapped, and hidden by the 21st dynasty priests who were trying to protect the remaining royal bodies from further desecration. The contrast between the robbed tombs and the intact tomb of Tutankhamun is the central fact of the Tutankhamun discovery, and the fact that gives the discovery its significance. The other tombs in the valley, the tombs of the great pharaohs, Thutmose III, Amenhotep III, Seti I, Ramesses II, have been emptied. Their walls are decorated, their architecture is impressive, but their contents are gone. Looted, scattered, melted down, dispersed across the antique markets of the ancient and the modern worlds. Tutankhamun's tomb is the exception. the one royal tomb in the valley that retained its contents, the one burial that survived the systematic looting that consumed every other royal tomb, and the contents, the 5,398 objects, the golden mask, the golden coffins, the 4 nested shrines, are the only complete assemblage of Egyptian royal funerary equipment that survives from any period of Egyptian history. The uniqueness of the assemblage is what gives it its value, not merely its monetary value, which is incalculable, but its informational value. The Tutankhamun assemblage is the only complete record of what an Egyptian royal burial contained, the only comprehensive inventory of the objects, the rituals, and the beliefs that the Egyptian mortuary tradition prescribed for the burial of a pharaoh. Every other royal tomb has been robbed, its contents removed, its information destroyed, its record of the burial practices lost. Tutankhamun's tomb is the one surviving data point, the one complete example from which the entire tradition of Egyptian royal burial can be reconstructed. The reconstruction has been one of the most productive enterprises in the history of Egyptology. The study of the Tutankhamun assemblage has provided information about every aspect of Egyptian royal funerary practice. The religious texts that were inscribed on the shrines and the coffins, the magical objects that were placed in the burial chamber, the personal objects that accompanied the king into the afterlife, the food and drink that were provided for his sustenance in the underworld, the clothing and jewellery that he would wear in eternity, the furniture and equipment that he would use in his eternal home. The information is comprehensive, the information is unique, and the information derived from a single tomb, of a single pharaoh, from a single moment in Egyptian history, has become the foundation of our understanding of the entire Egyptian royal burial tradition. The golden mask, the most famous object in the collection, and arguably the most famous artifact in the world, was placed directly on the mummy's face, between the innermost layer of linen wrappings and the interior surface of the innermost, solid gold, coffin. The mask is made from 2 sheets of gold hammered into shape and joined by welding. The gold is of high purity, approximately 23 carats. The face is inlaid with lapis lazuli for the eyebrows and the eye rims, obsidian for the pupils of the eyes, quartz for the whites of the eyes, and coloured glass for the Neem's headdress stripes. The mask weighs approximately 11 kilograms and measures 54 centimeters in height. The face of the mask, the serene, symmetrical, idealized face that has become the icon of ancient Egypt, is not a portrait of Tutankhamun. It is a theological image, a representation of the dead king as the god Osiris, the ruler of the underworld. The face follows the conventions of Egyptian royal iconography. The broad forehead, the almond-shaped eyes, the straight nose, the full lips, the serene expression. The conventions are designed to represent not the individual, but the type. Not Tutankhamun, the person, but the pharaoh, the institution. The divine king, whose face, in death, becomes the face of the god. The mask was cleaned and restored in 2015 after an incident in which the beard, a separate piece, attached to the chin of the mask with adhesive, was accidentally detached and reattached with inappropriate glue. The restoration, conducted by a German-Egyptian conservation team, removed the inappropriate adhesive, reattached the beard using a reversible adhesive, and cleaned the mask's surface, restoring the gold to its original luster. The restoration was a delicate operation, conducted on the most valuable object in the history of art, in a goldfish bowl atmosphere of media attention and public scrutiny, with the entire world watching to see whether the conservators could repair the damage without causing further harm. The burial chamber itself, the small room that contained the sarcophagus and the 4 nested shrines, is the only chamber in the tomb whose walls are decorated. The decoration follows the conventions of 18th dynasty royal tomb painting. Scenes from the Amduat, the text that describes the sun god's nightly journey through the underworld. The Book of the Dead, the collection of spells that protected the dead on their journey to the afterlife. And the opening of the mouth ceremony, the ritual that restored the mummy's ability to eat, drink, and breathe in the afterlife. The paintings are not of the highest quality. They are competent but not exceptional, consistent with a hastily prepared burial rather than a carefully planned one. The haste of the burial is one of the most discussed features of the tomb. The tomb was not originally intended for Tutankhamun. It was probably a non-royal tomb that was hastily adapted for the king's burial when he died unexpectedly at a young age. The tomb's small size, its limited decoration, and the disordered state of some of its contents all suggest a burial that was conducted under pressure. The pressure of the royal funeral schedule, which required the burial to take place within 70 days of the death. The time required for the mummification process. The haste produced a burial that was, by royal standards, inadequate. The tomb was too small. The 4 nested shrines filled the burial chamber almost completely, with barely enough room for the workers to maneuver. The decoration was incomplete. Only 1 chamber was painted, whereas a properly prepared royal tomb would have had painted decoration throughout. The objects were packed carelessly. The annex, in particular, showed signs of hasty, disordered packing that suggests the mortuary priests were running out of time. But the inadequacy of the tomb is also its significance. The tomb was too small and too obscure to attract the attention of tomb robbers, who targeted the larger, more prominently located, more richly furnished tombs of the great pharaohs. The tomb was too insignificant to be remembered. Its entrance was buried beneath construction debris within a century of the burial, and no one remembered that it was there. The inadequacy that made the tomb a poor burial made it a perfect time capsule, a sealed container hidden from the world, preserving its contents in the darkness for 3,300 years, waiting for the candle that would eventually illuminate the wonderful things. The wonderful things are now in the light. The Grand Egyptian Museum, the massive, purpose-built facility near the Giza pyramids, has received the entire collection and has displayed it for the first time in galleries that are designed to replicate something of the tomb's original spatial arrangement. The visitor walks through the galleries in the order in which Carter encountered the chambers: antechamber first, then burial chamber, then treasury, then annex, experiencing the objects in the sequence in which the ancient Egyptians placed them, and in the sequence in which Carter and his team recovered them. The Grand Egyptian Museum is the final destination of a journey that began on the 4th of November 1922, when a worker uncovered a stone step in the Valley of the Kings. The journey has taken more than a century, from the tomb to the workroom, from the workroom to the Egyptian Museum in Tahrir Square, from Tahrir Square to the Grand Egyptian Museum at Giza. The journey has moved the objects from the darkness of the tomb to the light of the museum, from the obscurity of the forgotten pharaoh to the fame of the most exhibited ruler in history, from the silence of 3,300 years to the noise of the modern world. The journey is complete. The objects are in their final home. The golden mask is behind glass. The golden coffin is on display. The 5,398 objects are visible, accessible, and available for study by scholars and for experience by visitors from across the world. And the boy king, the boy who was forgotten, whose name was erased, whose tomb was buried, whose existence was denied by the pharaohs who succeeded him, is at last fully visible, fully exhibited, fully known, the most famous pharaoh in history, the face of ancient Egypt, the wonderful things. The discovery of Tutankhamun's tomb in 1922 produced a cultural phenomenon that the modern world calls Tutmania, a wave of public fascination with ancient Egypt that swept across Europe and America in the 1920s, and that has never entirely subsided. The discovery was front-page news around the world. The excavation was followed by the international press with an intensity that no archaeological event had ever received. The objects that were recovered from the tomb, the golden mask, the golden coffins, the golden shrines, the jewellery, the furniture, the chariots, were reproduced in newspapers and magazines, depicted in films and newsreels, and imitated in the fashion, the architecture, and the decorative arts of the 1920s. The curse of the pharaohs, the popular belief that those who disturbed Tutankhamun's tomb would suffer supernatural punishment, was a product of this media frenzy. Lord Carnarvon died on the 5th of April 1923, roughly 5 months after the discovery of the first step, from pneumonia following an infected mosquito bite. The death, coming so soon after the discovery, was seized upon by the press, as evidence of a supernatural curse. The story was irresistible. The ancient Pharaoh, disturbed in his eternal rest, striking down the man who had violated his tomb. The story was also false. A study of the 58 people who were present when the tomb and the sarcophagus were opened found that only 8 died within a dozen years. Howard Carter himself died in 1939 at the age of 64, 17 years after the discovery. Lady Evelyn Herbert, who was among the first to enter the tomb, lived until 1980, 57 years after the discovery. The curse was a media construction, a sensationalist narrative, manufactured by newspapers seeking sales, sustained by public credulity, and reinforced by a cultural fascination with the supernatural that the discovery of a sealed Egyptian tomb was perfectly calibrated to exploit. The curse has no basis in fact, but the curse has become part of the Tutankhamun legend, inseparable from the story, embedded in the cultural memory, repeated in every popular account of the discovery, believed by millions of people who have never examined the evidence. The 10-year process of cataloguing and removing the tomb's contents, conducted by Carter and his team with extraordinary care and meticulous documentation, is one of the greatest achievements in the history of archaeological fieldwork. Carter documented every object in situ, recording its position, its orientation, its relationship to the surrounding objects, its condition, and its context within the tomb's spatial arrangement. The documentation was comprehensive: thousands of photographs, hundreds of drawings, detailed written descriptions, and numbered index cards that recorded the identity and the location of every one of the 5,398 objects. The documentation was essential because the removal of the objects destroyed the tomb's integrity. The spatial relationships between the objects, the way they were arranged and stacked and nested within the tomb's chambers, could only be recorded before the objects were moved. Carter understood this. He insisted on documenting everything before touching anything. The insistence slowed the work. The excavation took 10 years, from 1922 to 1932, when the last objects were removed from the tomb. But the insistence produced a record that is, by the standards of early 20th century archaeology, extraordinarily complete, a record that allows modern scholars to reconstruct the arrangement of the tomb's contents with a precision that would be impossible if the objects had been removed. Without documentation, the Grand Egyptian Museum near the Giza Pyramids, which opened its dedicated Tutankhamun galleries in late 2025, now displays the complete collection of more than 5,000 objects together in a single space for the first time in history. The previous display at the Egyptian Museum in Tahrir Square in Cairo had shown only roughly 1,700 of the objects at any given time, with the remainder in storage. The Grand Egyptian Museum displays the entire collection, arranged in something close to the spatial order in which Carter found them, allowing the visitor to experience the tomb's contents in roughly the sequence in which the ancient Egyptians placed them. The cultural impact of the Tutankhamun discovery extends far beyond the field of Egyptology. The discovery produced a global phenomenon, Tutmania, that influenced fashion, architecture, interior design, jewelry, cinema, and popular culture in ways that no archaeological discovery had ever done before, and that no archaeological discovery has equaled since. Egyptian motifs appeared on clothing, on buildings, on household objects. Egyptian revival architecture, buildings decorated with pharaonic columns, winged sun discs, and hieroglyphic inscriptions, became fashionable in the 1920s. Egyptian-themed films, from early silent movies to Cecil B. DeMille's epic productions, capitalized on the public fascination with the boy king and his golden treasures. The exhibitions that have toured the world, displaying selected objects from the tomb in museums across Europe, North America, Asia, and Australia, have been among the most successful museum exhibitions in history. The first international tour in the 1970s attracted unprecedented crowds, millions of visitors in each city, queues that stretched for blocks, a level of public engagement that transformed the relationship between museums and their audiences. The exhibitions demonstrated that archaeological objects could attract the same kind of public enthusiasm that had previously been reserved for sporting events and rock concerts. A discovery that changed the museum world and that established the blockbuster exhibition as a major cultural format. The Tutankhamun brand, the commercial exploitation of the Boy King's name and image, has generated revenues that dwarf the revenues of any other archaeological brand. Tutankhamun merchandise, books, posters, replicas, jewelry, clothing, games, and every conceivable consumer product bearing the golden mask or the pharaoh's name, has been sold in quantities that are difficult to calculate, and in markets that extend to every corner of the world. The boy king who accomplished nothing in life has generated more commercial revenue in death than virtually any other historical figure. The commercial exploitation raises ethical questions that the archaeological community has debated for decades. Is it appropriate to commercialize a 3,000-year-old burial? Is it respectful to reproduce the face of a dead king on coffee mugs and refrigerator magnets? Is the commercial exploitation a form of tribute, a modern equivalent of the offerings that the ancient priests presented to the king's ka, or is it a form of desecration, a trivialization of the sacred that the Egyptian mortuary tradition was designed to protect? The questions have no easy answers. The commercial exploitation has generated revenue that has funded archaeological research, museum construction, and heritage conservation. It has also generated a popular awareness of ancient Egypt that has inspired generations of students, scholars, and enthusiasts. The commercialization is both beneficial and problematic, a paradox that the Tutankhamun story, which is itself built on paradoxes, is perhaps uniquely qualified to illustrate. The curse of the pharaohs, the most persistent and most commercially successful element of the Tutankhamun legend, deserves a final word. The curse has no basis in fact. The statistical evidence does not support it. The mortality rate among the people who were present at the tomb's opening was not significantly higher than the mortality rate of the general population. The curse was a media construction, a narrative manufactured by journalists who needed a sensational story to sell newspapers, sustained by public credulity and reinforced by the coincidental deaths of a few individuals whose connection to the tomb was tenuous at best. But the curse has been enormously influential. It has shaped the public perception of Egyptian archaeology for more than a century. It has inspired novels, films, television programs, and video games. It has become embedded in the cultural vocabulary. The curse of the pharaohs is a phrase that is known to virtually every English-speaking person, a cultural meme that has outlasted the journalistic context that produced it. The curse is more famous than the actual contents of the tomb. The curse is more widely believed than the actual circumstances of the discovery. The curse is, in many respects, a more powerful cultural product than the golden mask itself, because the curse is a story, and stories, in the currency of popular culture, are more valuable than objects. The relationship between Tutankhamun and the modern world is a relationship that is mediated entirely by objects, by the golden mask, the golden coffins, the throne, the jewelry, the chariots, the 5,398 objects that Carter catalogued over 10 years of painstaking work. The objects are the interface, the medium through which the modern world encounters the boy king, the physical evidence on which the Tutankhamun legend is built. Without the objects, there is no legend. Without the golden mask, there is no fame. Without the tomb, Tutankhamun would be a footnote, a minor pharaoh, briefly mentioned in the scholarly literature, known only to specialists, forgotten by everyone else. The objects have made Tutankhamun famous, but the objects have also obscured Tutankhamun. The actual person, the actual boy, the actual child who sat on the throne of Egypt at 9 years of age, who walked with a cane because his foot was deformed, who married his half-sister because the dynasty required it, who fathered 2 children who were born dead, who died at 18 or 19 from a combination of malaria and an infected leg fracture, and who was buried in a small, hastily prepared tomb by advisors who were already planning the seizure of power that would follow his death. The person is hidden behind the objects, the boy is hidden behind the gold, the tragedy is hidden behind the spectacle, and the Tutankhamun that the world knows, the golden face, the fabulous treasure, the curse, the merchandising empire, has almost nothing to do with the Tutankhamun who actually lived. The boy who lived was not golden. He was sick, he was disabled, he was powerless. He was a pawn, placed on the throne by adults who needed a figurehead, managed by advisors who governed in his name, married to a girl who was his half-sister, and killed, not by a curse but by malaria and a broken bone, before he had a chance to become anything more than the instrument of other people's ambitions. The gap between the golden Tutankhamun and the actual Tutankhamun, between the image and the person, between the legend and the reality, between the mask and the face beneath the mask, is the deepest paradox of the Tutankhamun story. The mask is beautiful. The face beneath the mask is damaged. The CT scans show the injuries, the deformities, the evidence of a body that was breaking down. The golden coffin is magnificent. The body inside the coffin is frail. The bones of a teenager who could not walk without a cane, whose spine was curved, whose foot was twisted, whose DNA carried the consequences of generations of inbreeding. The treasure is extraordinary. The life that produced the treasure was ordinary. A brief, unremarkable, politically insignificant reign, cut short by disease, buried in a small tomb, and forgotten by the world for 3,300 years. The ordinariness of the life and the extraordinariness of the death, the insignificance of the reign and the magnificence of the burial, is the paradox that defines Tutankhamun. The boy was ordinary, the tomb was extraordinary, the life was forgettable, the death was unforgettable, and the gap between the two, between the ordinary life and the extraordinary death, between the forgotten reign and the unforgotten tomb, is the space in which the Tutankhamun legend was born and in which it continues, more than a century after Carter held up his candle and saw the wonderful things, to flourish. The legend will endure. The golden mask will endure. The 5,398 objects, now displayed together for the first time in the Grand Egyptian Museum, will endure. And the boy, the actual boy, the sick child, the powerless king, the forgotten pharaoh whose erasure preserved his tomb and whose tomb made him immortal, will endure with them. Not as he was, not as the person he actually was, the disabled teenager who walked with a cane and who died of malaria and a broken bone, but as the golden face, as the wonderful things, as the most famous pharaoh in history, famous not for what he did, but for what was done to him, not for his achievements, but for his accidents, not for his power, but for his powerlessness. The powerlessness made the tomb possible. The tomb made the discovery possible. The discovery made the fame possible. And the fame, the global, century-long, commercially inexhaustible fame of the boy king, is the final, most devastating paradox of a story that is built entirely on paradoxes. The least powerful pharaoh became the most famous. The most forgotten became the most remembered. The most erased became the most exhibited. And the boy with the cane and the broken bone and the malaria and the stillborn children, became, through the accident of his tomb's survival, the face of ancient Egypt, the golden face, the eternal face, the face that the world will never forget, that was placed on the body of a boy the world was meant to forget, in a tomb that was sealed in darkness 3,300 years ago, and that was opened by candlelight on a November afternoon in 1922 to reveal the wonderful things. The historical context of Tutankhamun's reign, the last years of the 18th dynasty, the transition from the Amarna period to the Ramesside period, is one of the most complex and most consequential periods in the history of the New Kingdom. The 18th dynasty, which had been founded by Ahmose I around 1550 BC, after the expulsion of the Hyksos foreign rulers, had produced some of the most famous pharaohs in Egyptian history: Hatshepsut, Thutmose III, Amenhotep III, Akhenaten. The dynasty had built the Egyptian empire, had expanded Egyptian control from Nubia in the south to Syria in the north, had constructed the great temples of Karnak and Luxor, and had established Egypt as the dominant power in the ancient Near East. The Amarna Revolution, Akhenaten's attempt to abolish the traditional religion and to replace it with the exclusive worship of the Aten, shattered this achievement. The revolution alienated the priesthood, it disrupted the economy, it destabilized the administration, and it weakened Egypt's position in the international arena. The vassal kings of the Levant, who had previously relied on Egyptian military support against the Hittite threat, were abandoned by a pharaoh who was more interested in his religious revolution than in the defense of his empire. The Amarna letters, the diplomatic correspondence preserved at Akhenaten's capital, contain desperate pleas from the vassal kings, begging for military assistance that never arrived. Tutankhamun inherited this mess. He was a child, placed on the throne at 9, managed by advisors who understood that the Amarna revolution had to be reversed and who set about reversing it with systematic efficiency. The restoration of the Amun cult, the reopening of the temples, the re-endowment of the priesthoods, the return of the capital to Thebes, was the most visible element of the reversal. But the reversal also included military campaigns, limited operations in Nubia and in the Levant that were designed to reassert Egyptian authority in the regions that Akhenaten had neglected. These campaigns were commanded by the general Horemheb, the military strongman who would eventually seize the throne after Tutankhamun's death, and who was, during Tutankhamun's reign, the most powerful man in Egypt. The relationship between Tutankhamun and his advisors, particularly the Vizier I and the general Horemheb, is one of the most debated questions in the political history of the 18th dynasty. Were the advisors loyal servants, acting in the best interests of the boy king and the kingdom, or were they ambitious opportunists using the boy king as a puppet while positioning themselves for the eventual seizure of power? The evidence is ambiguous. The restoration of the Amun cult can be read as either a sincere act of religious devotion or a calculated political move designed to win the support of the Amun priesthood. The military campaigns can be read as either a genuine attempt to restore Egypt's international position or a personal campaign by Horemheb to build his own military reputation. The ambiguity is inherent in the evidence, and the evidence, filtered through 3,300 years of destruction and erasure, is insufficient to resolve the ambiguity definitively. What is not ambiguous is the outcome. Tutankhamun died young, I seized the throne, Horemheb succeeded I, and the 18th dynasty, the dynasty of Thutmose, of Amenhotep, of Akhenaten, of Tutankhamun, ended. Horemheb, who was not of royal blood, founded no dynasty. His successor, Ramesses I, a military officer whom Horemheb appointed as his heir, established the 19th dynasty, the dynasty of Seti I and Ramesses II. The transition from the 18th to the 19th dynasty was managed by Horemheb, the general who had served Tutankhamun, who had probably participated in the murder of the Hittite prince, and who had, after the deaths of Tutankhamun and I, positioned himself as the last legitimate ruler of the 18th dynasty. Horemheb's erasure of Tutankhamun, his removal of Tutankhamun's name from the official records, his usurpation of Tutankhamun's monuments, his appropriation of Tutankhamun's regnal years, was the final act of the political drama that had been playing out since Akhenaten's death. The erasure was not merely personal. Horemheb did not erase Tutankhamun because he hated the boy. The erasure was institutional. Horemheb erased Tutankhamun because the boy was Akhenaten's son, because his reign was contaminated by its association with the heresy, because the new political order that Horemheb was establishing required the elimination of the Amarna taint from the official record. The erasure was a clean-up operation, a systematic, institutional, politically motivated act of historical editing that was designed to present the transition from the 18th to the 19th dynasty as seamless and uncontaminated by the heretical interlude. The editing was almost successful. Tutankhamun was almost completely removed from the historical record. His name survived in a few obscure places, in the fragments of the Restoration Stela, in a few objects that bore his original name, Tutankhaten, in the scattered evidence that the scholars of the 19th and 20th centuries pieced together to reconstruct his existence. But the reconstruction was tentative. Until the discovery of the tomb, Tutankhamun was a shadowy figure, known more from absence than from presence. A gap in the king lists, a missing link in the dynastic sequence. The discovery of the tomb in 1922 filled the gap, spectacularly, overwhelmingly, with 5,398 objects that documented the boy king's existence, with a completeness that no other pharaoh's burial could match. The discovery converted the shadowy figure into the most famous pharaoh in history. The gap in the king list became the face of Egypt, The missing link became the most exhibited ruler in the world. And the erasure, the institutional, politically motivated erasure that was supposed to condemn Tutankhamun to oblivion, was reversed, not by a political decree, but by an archaeological discovery, not by a pharaoh's edict, but by a British archaeologist's candle, not by the restoration of a name on a king list, but by the revelation of 5,398 wonderful things in a small tomb in the Valley of the Kings. The reversal is the most satisfying irony in the history of archaeology. The pharaohs who erased Tutankhamun, Horemheb, who usurped his monuments, Seti, who omitted him from the Abydos king list, Ramesses, who built over his constructions, are known to scholars but not to the general public. Tutankhamun, the pharaoh who was erased, the boy whose name was removed, the king whose existence was denied, is known to everyone. The erasers are forgotten. The erased is famous. The pharaohs who built the largest monuments and who inscribed their names on every available surface are, in the popular imagination, less well known than the boy king, who built nothing and whose name was chiseled from the walls. The fame is not proportional to the achievement. The fame is inversely proportional to the achievement. The least achieving pharaoh is the most famous. The most erased is the most remembered. The most forgotten is the most exhibited. The inverse proportion is the Tutankhamun paradox, the defining structural feature of the boy king's story, the feature that makes the story not merely interesting but philosophically significant. The paradox says, fame is not earned, fame is accidental. The golden mask is not the reward for a great reign. It is the consequence of a small tomb, an obscure burial, a forgotten pharaoh, and an accidental preservation. The mask is the accident. The fame is the accident. And the boy, the actual boy, the sick child, the disabled teenager who walked with a cane and died of malaria, is the vehicle for the accident, the person through whom the accident occurred, the forgotten pharaoh who became, through no merit and no intention of his own, the most famous ruler in the history of human civilization. The accident is the story is the lesson, and the lesson of Tutankhamun, the lesson of the wonderful things, the lesson of the boy king who was erased and who endured, is that preservation is not a reward for greatness. Preservation is an accident. The greatest are destroyed, the least are preserved. And the golden mask, the most famous face in the world, the symbol of ancient Egypt, the icon of 3,000 years of civilization, is not the face of greatness, it is the face of accident, the face of a boy who was forgotten, the face of a king who was erased, the face that the world was never supposed to see. The world has seen it. The world cannot look away. And the boy, Tutankhamun, the living image of Amun, the boy king, the forgotten pharaoh, the most famous ruler in the history of Egypt, looks back, from behind the glass, from behind the gold, from behind the 3,300 years of darkness that separated his burial from his discovery. He looks back, and he says nothing. The golden mouth is closed, the golden eyes are open, and the expression, serene, composed, eternal, the expression that has not changed in 3,300 years, says everything that needs to be said. The boy endures, the gold endures, the wonderful things endure. And the story of the forgotten pharaoh who became the most famous ruler in history, the story of the erasure that preserved the tomb, the story of the candle and the darkness and the golden face, endures with them. The tomb's survival was the product of 3 accidents that, had any one of them not occurred, would have resulted in the tomb being robbed and its contents dispersed, like those of every other royal tomb in the valley. The first accident was the smallness of the tomb. Tutankhamun's tomb was not a grand royal sepulchre. It was a small, non-royal tomb that was hastily adapted for the king's burial. The smallness meant that the tomb was less visible, less prominent, and less likely to attract the attention of the tomb robbers, who systematically targeted the larger, more prominently located royal tombs. The second accident was the burial of the entrance. When the tomb of Ramesses VI was cut into the cliff face roughly a century and a half after Tutankhamun's burial, the construction workers dumped their debris, the limestone chips and rubble from the cutting of the new tomb, directly on top of the area where Tutankhamun's entrance was located. The debris buried the entrance beneath several meters of rock. The construction workers then built their living huts on top of the debris, adding another layer of concealment to the already buried entrance. The burial was accidental. The workers did not know that they were covering the entrance to a royal tomb. But the burial was decisive. It sealed the entrance so completely that no subsequent visitor to the valley could have found it without deliberately excavating through the debris and the huts. The third accident was the ancient robberies and their failure. The tomb was robbed at least twice in antiquity. Ancient break-ins that penetrated the outer chambers, the antechamber and the annex, but that apparently did not reach the burial chamber or the treasury. The robbers took small, portable, high-value objects, oils, ointments, jewelry, and possibly some gold items, but left the large, heavy objects, the shrines, the coffins, the sarcophagus, untouched. The robberies were detected. The tomb was resealed by the necropolis officials, who repacked the disturbed objects, replastered the breached doorways, and reapplied the necropolis seals. The resealing preserved the tomb's contents. Everything that the robbers had not taken was left in place, sealed behind replastered doorways, protected by the necropolis seals that Carter would find intact 3,000 years later. These three accidents, the smallness, the burial, and the failed robberies, are the conditions that produced the most famous archaeological discovery in history. Remove any one of them, make the tomb larger, leave the entrance unburied, or allow the robberies to reach the burial chamber, and the tomb would have been emptied, its contents dispersed, its golden mask melted down, its coffin stripped, and Tutankhamun would have remained what Horemheb intended him to be: a forgotten pharaoh, a gap in the king lists, a nobody. The discovery of the tomb in 1922 was itself a product of persistence and near miss. Carter had been searching for the tomb for 6 years. 6 seasons of systematic, grid-by-grid excavation that had produced nothing of significance. The funding was running out. The patron was losing patience. The archaeological establishment had largely concluded that the valley was exhausted, that every tomb worth finding had already been found. Carter's decision to excavate beneath the workers' huts, the one area of the valley that he had not yet fully investigated, was a final, desperate gamble. The gamble paid off. But the margin was razor thin. One more season of failure, and Carnarvon would have cut the funding. Carter would have been forced to abandon the search, and the tomb would have remained hidden, possibly for decades or centuries more. The moment of discovery, the moment when Carter peered through the hole in the sealed doorway and saw the wonderful things, is the most famous moment in the history of archaeology. The moment has been described, depicted, dramatized, and reenacted hundreds of times in books, in films, in television programs, in museum exhibitions, in the popular imagination. The moment is iconic. The archaeologist, the candle, the darkness, the gold, the question. Can you see anything? The answer, yes, wonderful things. The moment is also, in its simplicity, profoundly moving. A human being, standing at the boundary between the known and the unknown, peering through a hole in a wall that has been sealed for 3,300 years, and seeing, for the first time, the treasures that the darkness has preserved. The treasures that the darkness preserved are now in the light. The Grand Egyptian Museum, opened in 2025 near the Giza Pyramids, displays the complete Tutankhamun collection for the first time in history. Previous displays at the Egyptian Museum in Tahrir Square in Cairo, where the collection was housed for more than 80 years, had shown only a portion of the objects, with the majority in storage, unseen by the public. The Grand Egyptian Museum displays the entire collection, all 5,398 objects, arranged in galleries that are designed to replicate the spatial arrangement of the tomb, allowing the visitor to experience the objects in the order in which Carter encountered them. The museum is the culmination of a century-long journey, from the tomb to the museum, from the darkness to the light, from the obscurity of the forgotten pharaoh to the fame of the most exhibited ruler in history. The journey has been punctuated by milestones: the discovery in 1922, the opening of the burial chamber in 1923, the removal of the golden mask in 1925, the completion of the excavation in 1932, the transfer of the collection to the Egyptian Museum in the 1930s and 40s, the international touring exhibitions of the 1970s and the 2000s, and the final relocation to the Grand Egyptian Museum in 2024 and 25. Each milestone has added to the Tutankhamun legend. The accumulating narrative of discovery, conservation, exhibition, and public fascination that has made the Boy King the most culturally significant archaeological discovery in history. The legend is not merely Egyptian, it is global. The Boy King belongs to the world. His golden face is recognized by billions. His name is known in every language. His story is told in every culture. The legend transcends the specific archaeological details. It is a story about the human confrontation with the past, about the discovery of the hidden, about the revelation of the wonderful things that the darkness preserves and that the light reveals. The story began with a stone step, cut into the bedrock of the Valley of the Kings, uncovered on the 4th of November 1922 by a worker whose name is recorded in some accounts as Hussein Abdel Russell, a water boy carrying water for Carter's excavation team. The step led to a staircase. The staircase led to a doorway. The doorway led to a corridor. The corridor led to another doorway. And the doorway, the sealed, plastered, stamp-marked doorway that had been closed for 3,300 years, led to the wonderful things. The wonderful things are now visible. They are behind glass. They are in a museum. They are in the light. And the Boy King, the boy who was placed on the throne at 9, who walked with a cane, who died at 18 or 19, who was erased from history, who was buried in a small tomb, who was forgotten for 3,300 years, is visible too. Visible in the golden mask, visible in the golden coffins, visible in the 5,398 objects that document his burial with a completeness that no other burial in the history of the world has achieved. The completeness is the gift. The gift was accidental, the product of 3 accidents: the smallness, the burial, the failed robberies that preserved the tomb while every other royal tomb in the valley was emptied. The gift was unintended. Tutankhamun did not choose to be forgotten, did not choose to have his tomb buried beneath construction debris, did not choose to be the subject of a failed Damatio Memoriae that would inadvertently preserve his burial for 3,300 years. The gift was, in every respect, an accident, the product of circumstances that no one planned, no one intended, and no one could have predicted. The accident is the miracle. The miracle is the Tutankhamun story. And the story of the Boy King who was forgotten and found, who was erased and exhibited, who was condemned to oblivion and given immortality, is the most powerful demonstration in the history of archaeology that the past is not predictable, that preservation is not earned, and that the wonderful things, the wonderful, golden, 3,300-year-old things, are waiting in the darkness for the candle that will bring them back to the light. The mummy of Tutankhamun, the physical remains of the Boy King, wrapped in linen, adorned with amulets and jewelry, placed in the innermost coffin within the quartzite sarcophagus, was in poor condition when Carter unwrapped it in November of 1925. The poor condition was largely a consequence of the unguents, the sacred oils and resins that the mortuary priests had poured over the mummy during the burial ceremony. The unguents, which had been applied in generous quantities, had undergone a chemical reaction over 3,000 years, polymerizing, hardening, and bonding the linen wrappings to the body and to the interior surface of the coffin. The bonding was so complete that Carter was unable to separate the mummy from the coffin using conventional methods. He was forced to use heat, holding the coffin upside down over a lamp, to soften the resinous deposit and to free the body. The unwrapping revealed a body that was significantly damaged. The head was detached from the torso, the limbs were fragile, the skin was darkened by the resinous deposits, and the chest wall was largely destroyed, possibly by post-mortem damage during the embalming process. The golden mask had been placed directly on the face, with a linen pad between the mask and the skin. The face beneath the mask was surprisingly well preserved. The features were recognizable, the skin was intact, the expression was composed. The face of Tutankhamun, revealed for the first time in 3,300 years, was the face of a young man, a teenager with a narrow chin, a broad forehead, and the slightly protruding teeth that are characteristic of the Thutmosid royal family. The forensic examination of the mummy has been conducted in several phases, using progressively more sophisticated technology. The first examination, conducted by the anatomist Douglas Derry in 1925, was a conventional autopsy. The mummy was unwrapped, the body was examined visually, and the findings were recorded in writing and in photographs. Derry estimated the king's age at death at approximately 18 years and noted the narrow, elongated skull that is characteristic of the Amarna royal family. The second examination, conducted by the University of Liverpool team led by R.G. Harrison in 1968, was the first to use X-ray technology. The X-rays revealed bone fragments inside the skull, fragments that were initially interpreted as evidence of a blow to the head, suggesting that Tutankhamun may have been murdered. The murder hypothesis, the idea that the boy king was killed by a blow to the head, possibly inflicted by Ai or Horemheb, was widely publicized and became, for several decades, one of the most popular theories about Tutankhamun's death. The third examination, conducted by the Egyptian team led by Zahi Hawass in 2005, used CT, computed tomography scanning, a technology that produces detailed, three-dimensional images of the body's internal structure without the physical destruction that conventional autopsy requires. The CT scan produced more than 1,700 cross-sectional images of the mummy, a comprehensive anatomical record that allowed the researchers to examine every bone, every joint, every organ, or the space where the organ had been, in unprecedented detail. The CT scan results contradicted the murder hypothesis. The bone fragments inside the skull, which had been interpreted as evidence of a blow to the head, were identified as fragments of bone that had broken loose during the embalming process when the brain was removed through the nasal cavity. The fragments were not evidence of a blow. They were evidence of embalming, a routine procedure that involved the insertion of a metal hook through the nose, the breaking of the ethmoid bone, and the extraction of the brain through the resulting hole. The bone fragments found by the X-ray were fragments of the ethmoid bone, broken during embalming, not during an assault. The CT scan did, however, reveal the severe fracture of the left leg, a break of the left femur, just above the knee, that had become infected before death. The fracture was not a post-mortem break. The CT scan showed evidence of a healing response, indicating that the fracture occurred during the king's lifetime, that the body had begun to heal the break, and that the healing process was interrupted by death. The infection that developed in the fracture, visible in the CT scan as an area of bone destruction and soft tissue swelling, may have been a contributing factor in the king's death, particularly in combination with the malarial infection that the DNA analysis revealed 5 years later. The DNA analysis, published in 2010, was the most comprehensive genetic study ever conducted on an Egyptian royal mummy. The analysis examined tissue samples from Tutankhamun and from 11 other royal mummies, producing a genetic family tree that confirmed the identity of Tutankhamun's parents, Akhenaten and the younger lady from KV35, who was Akhenaten's full sister, identified the genetic conditions that affected the royal family, including the bone disorder that produced Tutankhamun's club foot and detected the malaria parasite in Tutankhamun's tissue, evidence that the king suffered from the most severe form of the disease, Plasmodium falciparum malaria, at the time of his death. The combination of evidence, the fractured leg, the malarial infection, the genetic bone disorder, the general physical weakness produced by generations of inbreeding, paints a picture of a young man whose body was breaking down. The fracture was probably the immediate crisis, a break that became infected, that the body could not fight because it was already weakened by malaria and by the genetic conditions. The death was medical, not criminal. The boy king was not murdered. He was killed by a combination of disease, injury, and the genetic legacy of his parents' consanguinity. The medical evidence humanizes Tutankhamun in a way that the golden mask does not. The mask is beautiful, idealized, symmetrical, perfect, the face of a god. The body beneath the mask is damaged, fragile, imperfect, the body of a sick teenager who walked with a cane and who died before he was 20. The gap between the mask and the body, between the divine image and the human reality, is the gap between the legend and the person, between the icon and the individual, between the golden Tutankhamun that the world knows and the actual Tutankhamun who actually lived. The actual Tutankhamun is the more important figure and the more tragic one. The golden Tutankhamun is a legend, a cultural phenomenon, a commercial brand, a museum attraction. The actual Tutankhamun is a person, a sick child, placed on a throne he did not choose, burdened with a legacy he did not create, married to a half-sister who would bear him only dead children, governed by advisors who used him as a puppet, and killed by a combination of malaria and a broken bone before he had a chance to become anything more than a name on a golden coffin. The person deserves to be known. Not just the mask, not just the treasure, not just the curse and the commerce and the exhibitions. The person, the boy, the child who inherited a kingdom in crisis and who did the best he could, or whose advisors did the best they could on his behalf, to restore the kingdom to order. The child who walked with a cane, who played sonnet, who hunted ostriches from his chariot. The tomb contains hunting equipment that suggests he was an active hunter, despite his physical limitations, who loved his wife. The golden throne, with its intimate scene of Tutankhamun anointing her husband, suggests a relationship of genuine tenderness, who died young, who was buried in a small tomb, who was forgotten for 3,300 years. The forgetting is over. The person has been found. Not just the tomb, but the person. The CT scans, the DNA analysis, the forensic reconstruction of the face, the medical examination of the body. All of these technologies have brought the actual Tutankhamun back from the dead, not as a golden mask, not as a legend, but as a person, a specific, identifiable, medically documented individual whose face can be reconstructed, whose diseases can be diagnosed, whose family relationships can be mapped, and whose cause of death can be determined with a reasonable degree of confidence. The technologies that have revealed the person are the technologies of the 21st century. CT scanning, DNA analysis, forensic reconstruction, genetic mapping. The technologies did not exist when Carter discovered the tomb. They did not exist when Derry unwrapped the mummy. They did not exist when Harrison X-rayed the skull. They exist now, and their application to Tutankhamun's mummy has produced the most detailed, most comprehensive, most scientifically rigorous portrait of an ancient individual that has ever been compiled. The portrait is the gift of modern science to an ancient king, a gift that the Egyptians who buried him could not have imagined, a gift that the scholars who studied him could not have anticipated, a gift that the public who visits him in the museum cannot fully appreciate. The portrait says, this was a person, this was a real person, not a golden face, not a legend, not a curse, a person, a boy. A king who walked with a cane and died of malaria and was buried in a small tomb and was forgotten and found and exhibited and studied and known. Known at last, not as the golden face but as the person behind it. The person is the discovery. The person is the wonderful thing. And the person, Tutankhamun, the boy king, the forgotten pharaoh, the most famous ruler in the history of Egypt, is the reason that the candle was held up to the darkness, that the hole was chipped in the wall, that the question was asked, can you see anything? And that the answer that changed the world, that rewrote the history of archaeology, that made the most erased pharaoh the most famous, was given. Yes, wonderful things. The three nested coffins that enclose Tutankhamun's mummy constitute one of the most extraordinary sets of manufactured objects in the history of human craftsmanship. The outermost coffin, roughly 2 meters and 24 centimeters long, is made of cypress wood, covered with gold leaf, and inlaid with coloured glass and semi-precious stones. The coffin depicts the king in the Osiris posture, arms crossed over the chest, holding the crook and the flail, the symbols of royal authority, wearing the Nemes headdress with the uraeus, the rearing cobra that symbolised divine protection. The gold leaf that covers the coffin's surface is thin, a few tenths of a millimetre thick, but the application is precise, covering every surface with a continuous, seamless sheet of gold that catches the light and that produces the visual impression of a coffin made from solid gold. The middle coffin, slightly smaller, fitting within the outermost coffin, is also made of wood covered with gold leaf, but its decoration is more elaborate. The coffin is inlaid with coloured glass in a pattern that imitates the feathered wings of the goddesses Isis and Nephthys, the two divine sisters who protected the dead Osiris and who were invoked in the funerary ritual as the protectors of the dead king. The feathered pattern, known as rishi, from the Arabic word for feather, is one of the most distinctive decorative motifs in Egyptian funerary art, and the middle coffin of Tutankhamun is one of the finest examples of the technique. The innermost coffin, the one that directly enclosed the mummy, is made of solid gold. The coffin weighs approximately 110 kilograms, roughly 243 pounds, of gold that is approximately 22.5 carats in purity. The monetary value of the gold alone is, at current market prices, several $1,000,000. The artistic value is incalculable. The coffin is one of the most remarkable gold-working achievements in the history of human manufacture. A life-sized container, hammered from sheets of gold, assembled with extraordinary precision, decorated with the same Osiris iconography as the outer coffins, and finished to a standard that modern goldsmiths consider virtually impossible to replicate. The decision to make the innermost coffin from solid gold, rather than from gilded wood, like the outer coffins, was a statement of the highest theological significance. Gold was, in Egyptian theology, the flesh of the gods, the material that the gods' bodies were made from, the substance that was closest to the divine, the medium that transformed the mortal body of the dead king into the divine body of the resurrected Osiris. By encasing the mummy in a coffin of solid gold, the mortuary priests were performing the final act of the king's deification, wrapping the mortal body in the divine substance, transforming the dead boy into the living God, completing the theological transformation that the funerary ritual was designed to achieve. The transformation is the purpose of the entire burial. Every object in the tomb, from the golden mask to the smallest amulet, is designed to facilitate, to protect, and to ensure the king's transformation from a mortal boy to an immortal god. The Shabti figures, 413 of them, carved from wood, stone and faience, each one a miniature servant intended to perform manual labour on the king's behalf in the afterlife, ensure that the king will never have to work. The canopic jars, 4 miniature coffins, each one containing one of the king's preserved internal organs, each one protected by one of the 4 sons of Horus, ensure that the king's body will be complete in the afterlife. The food offerings, bread, meat, fruit, wine, and beer, placed in sealed containers throughout the tomb, ensure that the king will never be hungry. The clothing, the jewellery, the furniture, the games. Every object serves a specific function in the afterlife, providing the king with everything he will need for eternity. The comprehensive nature of the provision, the sheer quantity and variety of the objects placed in the tomb, reflects the Egyptian belief that the afterlife was a continuation of life, not a departure from it. The dead king would eat, drink, dress, play, hunt, and govern in the afterlife just as he had done in life. The tomb was not merely a burial chamber. It was a house, a fully furnished house, equipped with everything the resident would need, designed for permanent occupancy, stocked with supplies that would last for eternity. The supplies did not last for eternity. The food has desiccated, the wine has evaporated, the linen has become brittle, the wood has dried and cracked. The gold alone has endured, uncorroded, untarnished, as brilliant today as it was when it was applied 3,300 years ago. Gold does not corrode. Gold does not tarnish. Gold does not deteriorate. The gold of Tutankhamun's burial is as pure, as lustrous, as visually stunning as it was on the day the tomb was sealed. The gold has outlasted everything, the food, the linen, the wood, the body itself. The gold is the one material that has survived the 3,300 years without change. The survival of the gold is the final paradox of the Tutankhamun story. Gold was chosen for the burial because it was the flesh of the gods, the substance that would transform the dead king into a divine being. The transformation was theological. It existed in the realm of belief, not in the realm of chemistry. But the chemistry confirmed the theology. Gold does not corrode. Gold does not change. Gold is, in chemical terms, the most stable of all metals, resistant to oxidation, resistant to acid, resistant to every chemical process that destroys other materials. The Egyptian theologians chose gold because they believed it was divine. The modern chemists confirm that gold is, in material terms, the closest thing to permanence that the physical world can offer. The theology and the chemistry agree. Gold endures. Gold is permanent. Gold is, as the Egyptians believed, the substance of the gods. The golden mask endures. The golden coffin endures. The golden shrines endure. And the boy who was placed within the gold, whose face was covered by the gold, whose body was enclosed by the gold, endures with them. Not because he was great, not because he was powerful, not because he deserved the permanence that the gold provides, but because the gold does not care about greatness. The gold does not care about power. The gold does not care about desert and merit, and the political calculations that determined which pharaohs were remembered and which were erased. The gold simply endures. Patient, uncorroded, brilliant, outlasting the erasure, outlasting the forgetting, outlasting the 3,300 years of darkness, outlasting everything except itself. The gold endures. The boy endures within the gold. And the world that forgot the boy for 3,300 years, and that has spent the last century trying to understand him, endures with them both. Enriched by the discovery, fascinated by the treasure, moved by the tragedy, and haunted by the golden face, by the serene expression, by the 11 kilograms of beaten gold that cover the features of a boy who died of malaria and a broken bone, and whose face, hidden behind the gold, is the face of the most famous and the most unknown pharaoh in the history of Egypt. So who was Tutankhamun? He was a boy, a child, placed on the throne of the world's most powerful state at the age of 9, burdened with the legacy of his father's religious revolution, surrounded by advisors who governed in his name, physically compromised by the genetic consequences of inbreeding, and dead before his 20th birthday. He was a minor pharaoh, one of the least significant rulers of the 18th dynasty, whose brief reign produced no military conquests, no architectural masterpieces, no literary compositions, no theological innovations. He was a forgotten pharaoh, deliberately erased from the historical record by his successors, who removed his name from the king lists, usurped his monuments, and claimed his regnal years as their own. And he is the most famous pharaoh in history, the most exhibited, the most reproduced, the most commercially exploited, the most culturally ubiquitous ruler in the 3,000-year history of Egyptian civilization. His golden mask is the most recognized face in the history of art. His tomb is the most visited site in the Valley of the Kings. His name is known to virtually every person on earth who has ever heard the word Egypt. The gap between the insignificance and the fame, between the forgotten boy king and the most famous pharaoh in history, is the central paradox of the Tutankhamun story. The paradox is not ironic. It is structural. It is built into the relationship between obscurity and preservation, between erasure and survival, between the deliberate forgetting that condemned Tutankhamun to oblivion and the accidental preservation that made him immortal. The fame is an accident. The golden mask is beautiful. The tomb's contents are extraordinary. The discovery story is compelling. But the fame is not a consequence of Tutankhamun's greatness. It is a consequence of his insignificance, of the smallness of his tomb, the obscurity of his reign, the thoroughness of his erasure, the completeness of the forgetting that ensured that his tomb, alone among the royal tombs of the Valley of the Kings, would survive intact for 3,300 years. The pharaohs who were great, Thutmose III, Amenhotep III, Ramesses II, have empty tombs. The pharaoh who was least, Tutankhamun, the boy king, the forgotten son of the heretic, has a tomb full of gold. The great have been robbed, the least has been preserved, and the preservation, the 5,000 objects, the golden mask, the solid gold coffin, has made the least the greatest, the forgotten the famous, the erased the immortal. The mummy of Tutankhamun remains in the tomb, in KV 62, in the Valley of the Kings, in the quartzite sarcophagus where Carter found it, where it has rested for more than 3,300 years. The mummy is the only element of the burial that was not removed to the museum. The mummy stays in the tomb, the treasure goes to the museum, and the boy king, the child who ruled Egypt for 10 years, who walked with a cane, who died before his 20th birthday, who was erased from history and then restored to it by the most famous archaeological discovery in the world, rests in his sarcophagus in the darkness of the valley, in the silence that has surrounded him since the last priest sealed the tomb's doorway and walked away 3,300 years ago. The silence was almost permanent. The erasure was almost complete. The boy king was almost forgotten forever, almost lost, almost erased, almost consigned to the oblivion that his successors intended. But the tomb survived, the golden mask survived, the 5,000 objects survived, and the boy king, the child pharaoh, the forgotten son of the heretic, survived with them, not in memory, not in inscription, not in the king lists or the monuments or the official records from which his name had been removed, but in gold, in lapis lazuli, in obsidian and turquoise and coloured glass, in the 11 kilograms of beaten gold that formed the mask that covered his face, in the 110 kilograms of solid gold that formed the coffin that held his body, in the 5,398 objects that his mortuary priests packed into the 4 small chambers of his tomb, and that waited, in the darkness, for 3,300 years, for someone to open the door and hold up a candle and see the wonderful things. The wonderful things are now at the Grand Egyptian Museum. The mummy is still in the tomb. The mask is behind glass. The coffin is on display. And the boy king, Tutankhamun, the living image of Amun, the forgotten pharaoh, the most famous ruler in the history of Egypt, endures, not because he was great, not because he was powerful, not because he accomplished anything that history would normally remember, but because he was forgotten. Because the forgetting preserved the tomb. Because the tomb preserved the gold. Because the gold preserved the face. And because the face, the golden face, the 11-kilogram mask, the most recognized image in the history of human art, has become, for the modern world, the face of ancient Egypt itself. The boy who was erased became the face of the civilization that erased him. The pharaoh who was condemned to oblivion became the symbol of the civilization that condemned him. And the tomb, the small, hastily prepared, insignificant tomb of a minor pharaoh in an obscure corner of the Valley of the Kings, became the most important archaeological site in the world. The mask endures, the boy endures, and the wonderful things, the wonderful, golden, 3,300-year-old things that Carter saw by candlelight on the 26th of November, 1922, endure with them. In the museum, in the memory, in the golden face that looks out from behind the glass with the same expression, serene, composed, eternal, that it has worn since the day it was placed on the face of a dead boy and sealed in the darkness to wait for the candle that would, 3,300 years later, bring the wonderful things back to the light.